Friends and viewer, good day. Today let us discuss about the another novel of Bronte's sister Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a young orphan being raised by Mrs. Reed. Her cruel, wealthy aunt, a servant named Bessie, provides Jane with some of a few kindnesses she receives, telling her stories, singing songs to her. One day, as punishment for fighting with her bullying cousin John Reed, Jane's aunt imprisoned Jane in the Red Room, the room in which Jane's Uncle Reed died while locked in. Believing that she sees her uncle's ghost, screams and faints. She wakes to find herself in the care of Bessie and the kindly apothecary Mr. Lloyd, who suggests to Mrs. Reed that Jane had been sent away to school. To Jane's delight, Mrs. Reed concurs. Once at the Lowood School, Jane finds her life is far from idyllic. The school's headmaster is Mr. Brocklehurst, a cruel, hypocritical and abusive man. Brocklehurst preaches a doctrine of poverty and privation to his students while using the school funds to provide a healthy, wealthy and opulent lifestyle for his own family. At Lowood, Jane befriends a young girl named Helen Burns, whose strong martyr-like attitude toward the school miseries both helpful and displeasing to Jane. A massive typhus epidemic sweeps Lowood, and Helen dies of consumption. The epidemic also results in the departure of Mr. Brocklehurst by attracting attention to the insalubrious condition at Lowood. After a group of more sympathetic gentlemen takes Brocklehurst's place, Jane's life improves dramatically. She spends 8 more years at Lowood, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. After teaching for 2 years, Jane yearns for new experiences. She accepts a governess position at manor called Thornfield, where she teaches a lively French girl named Adela. The distinguished housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, preside over the estate. Jane's employee at the Thornfield is dark, impassionate man named Rochester, with whom Jane finds herself falling secretly in love. She saved Rochester from a fire one night, which he claims was started by a drunken servant named Grace Poole. But because Grace Poole continues to work at Thornfield, Jane concludes that she has not been told the entire story. Jane sinks into despondency when Rochester brings home a beautiful but vicious woman named Blanche Ingram. Jane expects Rochester to propose for Blanche, but Rochester instead proposes to Jane, who accepts almost disbelievingly. The wedding day arrives, and as Jane and Mr. Rochester prepare to exchange their vows, the voice of Mr. Mason cries out that Rochester already has a wife. Mason introduces himself as the brother of that wife, a woman named Bertha. Mr. Mason testified that Bertha, whom Rochester married when he was a young man in Jamaica, is still alive. Rochester does not deny Mason's claims, but he explained that Bertha has gone mad. He takes the wedding party back to Thornfield, where they witness the insane Bertha Mason screwing around on the all four and growling like an animal's. Rochester keeps Bertha hidden on the 3rd story of Thornfield and pays Grace Poole to keep his wife under control. Bertha was the real cause of the mysteries. A fire a mysterious fire earlier in the story, knowing that it is impossible for her to be Rochester. Jane flees Thornfield. Penniless and hungry, Jane is forced to sleep outdoors and beg for food. At last, 3 siblings live in a manor alternatively called Marsh and Moor House take her in. Their name was Mary, Diana, and St. John Rivers, and Jane quickly becomes friends with them. St. John is a clergyman, and he finds Jane a job teaching in a charity school in Morton. He surprises her one day by declaring that her uncle John Eyre has died and left her a large fortune of £20,000. When Jane asks how he received this news, he shocks her further by declaring that her uncle was also Uncle's Jane, and the river seas are cousins. Jane immediately decides to share her inheritance equally with her 3 newfound relatives. St. John decides to travel to India as a missionary, and he urges Jane to accompany him. As his wife, Jane agrees to go to India, but refuses to marry her cousin because she does not love him. St. John pressures her to reconsider, and she nearly gives in. However, she realizes that she cannot abandon forever the man she truly loves. When one night she hears Rochester's voice calling her name over the moors, Jane immediately hurries back to Thornfield and finds that it has been burned to the ground by Bertha Mason, who lost her life in the fire. Rochester saved the servant but lost his eyesight and one of his hands. Jane travels to Rochester's new residence, Ferndene, where he lives with 2 servants named John and Mary. At Ferndene, Rochester and Jane rebuild their relationship, soon marry. At the end of her story, Jane writes that she has been married for 10 blissful years and that she and Rochester enjoy perfect equality in their life together. She says that after 2 years of blindness, Rochester regained sight in one eye and was able to behold their first son at his birth. So this is the story of the Jane Eyre. So, as far as the character involved in this novel is, as I've told you, all the characters. Jane Eyre, as you know, is the protagonist and narrator of the novel. Jane is an intelligent, honest, plain-featured young girl forced to contend with oppression, inequality, and hardship. Although she meets with series of individuals who threaten her autonomy, Jane repeatedly succeeds at asserting herself and maintain her principles of justice, human dignity, and morality. She also values intellectual, emotional fulfillment, a strong belief in gender and social equality, the Victorian prejudices against women and the poor. Edward Rochester, Jane's employer and the master of Thornfield. Rochester is a wealthy, passionate man with dark secrets that provide much of novel suspense. Rochester is unconventional, ready to set aside polite manner, propriety, and consideration of social class in order to interact with Jane frankly and directly. He is rash and impetuous and has spent much of his adult life roaming about Europe in an attempt to avoid the consequences of his youthful indiscretions. St. John Rivers, along with his sister Mary and Diana, St. John, pronounced Sinjin, serve as the Jane's benefactor after she runs away from Thornfield, giving her food and shelter. The minister at Morton, St. John, is cold, reserved, and often controlling in his interaction with her because he entirely alienated from his feeling, devoted solely to an austere ambitious. Mrs. Reed is a Jane's cruel aunt who raises her at Gateshead hall until Jane is sent away to school at age 10. Later in her life, Jane attempts reconciliation with her aunt, but the old woman continues to resent her because her husband had always loved Jane more than his own children. Bessie Lee, the maid at the gates, had Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd is a Reed's apothecary who suggests that Jane be sent away to school. Georgiana Reed is a Jane's cousin and one of Mrs. Reed's two daughters. The beautiful Georgiana threats Jane cruelly when they are children, but later in their life she befriends her cousin and confides in her. Eliza Reed, John Reed is a Jane's cousin. Helen Burns is a Jane's cousin friend at Lowood School. She endures her miserable life there with a passive dignity that Jane cannot. Helen dies of consumption in Jane's arm. Mr. Brocklehurst, the cruel, hypocritical master of Lowood School. Maria Temple is a kind teacher at Lowood. Mrs. Scatcherd, Jane's sore and vicious teacher at Lowood. Alice Fairfax is the housekeeper at Thornfield Hall. Bertha Mason, Rochester clandestine wife. Bertha Mason is a formerly beautifully and wealthy Creole woman who has become insane, violent, and bestial. Grace Poole is a Bertha's Mason keeper at Thornfield. Adela Vernes, Celine Vernes, Sophia Richard Mason, Blanchine Graham. These are the characters involved in this novel. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jane Eyre is the story of an orphan girl, as I had told you before, and this is also one of the great novel of the Bronte's sisters, and I hope you will enjoy it when you read it.